The First Crusade was a monumental event in medieval history, shaping the relationship between Europe and the Middle East for centuries. But to understand why it happened, we first need to look at the historical context of the late 11th century. Europe was a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, with the Catholic Church holding immense religious and political power. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire in the east was under increasing pressure from Muslim Seljuk Turks, who had conquered large portions of Anatolia after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos faced a serious threat as Turkish forces disrupted trade routes and threatened his empire's security. Desperate for military aid, he sent envoys to Western Europe, asking for knights to help defend his territories. Meanwhile, Europe was experiencing its own pressures: population growth, internal conflicts, and a desire among nobles for land, wealth, and spiritual recognition. It was against this backdrop that Pope Urban II took a decisive step. In 1095, during the Council of Clermont in France, he called for a military expedition to aid the Byzantines and to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The Pope framed this call as a holy duty, promising spiritual rewards, indulgences, to those who joined. This appeal tapped into deep religious sentiments across Europe and sparked enthusiasm among knights, peasants, and nobles alike. The First Crusade was unique because it combined religious fervor with military ambition. Participants believed they were taking part in a sacred mission, fighting not just for land or wealth, but for the salvation of their souls. The Pope's speech ignited a wave of excitement, inspiring thousands to take up the cross, a symbolic gesture showing commitment to the cause. Over the next few years, the First Crusade would become one of the most significant military campaigns of the Middle Ages. It involved long and dangerous journeys, fierce battles, and complex alliances. The motivations behind the crusade were varied: spiritual, economic, and political. But the result would forever change the dynamics between Europe and the Muslim world. In the following parts, we will explore how the crusade unfolded: the recruitment of armies, the perilous journey across Europe, the battles fought in Anatolia and the Levant, and ultimately the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. After Pope Urban II's call at the Council of Clermont in 1095, the First Crusade quickly gained momentum across Europe. People from all walks of life answered the Pope's call. Nobles, knights, and even peasants saw the crusade as an opportunity for spiritual reward, adventure, and wealth. The symbolic act of taking the cross, worn on clothing or armor, became a powerful declaration of commitment to the holy mission. Recruitment methods varied. Local lords would often gather their vassals and men-at-arms, promising land, protection, or titles to those who joined. Some knights sought personal glory, while others were motivated by the promise of indulgences, the Church's assurance that their sins would be forgiven if they fought for the holy cause. Ordinary people, inspired by faith and stories of Jerusalem, also joined in what would later be called the People's Crusade, a spontaneous movement led by preachers like Peter the Hermit. The journey of the Crusaders was long, arduous, and full of uncertainty. They traveled across Europe, through present-day France, Germany, and Italy, before reaching Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Many Crusaders faced severe hardships: disease, hunger, harsh weather, and attacks by bandits along the way. Despite these challenges, the idea of reclaiming the Holy Land and gaining divine favor kept morale high. When the Crusaders finally arrived in Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I was cautious. He welcomed them, but feared the massive, uncoordinated armies could pose a threat to his own power. The Crusaders were divided into different contingents, led by prominent European nobles, including Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois.
These leaders often had conflicting agendas, balancing loyalty to the Pope, their personal ambitions, and alliances with the Byzantines. Crossing into Asia Minor marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the Crusade. The Seljuk Turks controlled much of Anatolia, and the Crusaders would face unfamiliar terrain, guerrilla attacks, and logistical challenges. Yet the determination of these armies, fueled by religious zeal and the hope of eternal reward, drove them forward. Each step was a test of courage, endurance, and faith. The recruitment and initial journey of the First Crusade set the stage for what would become an epic military campaign. It showed both the power of religious motivation in medieval Europe and the enormous risks involved in mobilizing large, diverse armies across continents. As the Crusader armies crossed into Asia Minor, they entered a land dominated by the Seljuk Turks, who had been consolidating power since their victory at Manzikert in 1071. The terrain was harsh and unfamiliar, with mountains, deserts, and narrow passes that made movement difficult for large, heavily armed armies. Moreover, the Crusaders faced a foe well-versed in guerrilla warfare, using ambushes and hit-and-run tactics to weaken the invaders. The first major encounter came near Nicaea in 1097. The city, strategically located near the border of the Byzantine Empire, was heavily fortified and held by the Seljuks. The Crusaders, despite internal disagreements among their leaders, laid siege to Nicaea. It was a long and challenging operation, requiring coordination, patience, and innovative siege techniques. During this siege, the Crusaders faced shortages of food and water, disease, and constant harassment by Turkish cavalry. Yet their determination and the promise of spiritual rewards kept them advancing. Eventually, Nicaea fell to the Crusaders with the assistance of Emperor Alexios, who negotiated the city's surrender. The Byzantines regained control, but tensions arose as some Crusader leaders resented the emperor's role in claiming the city. This foreshadowed future conflicts between Western Crusaders and Byzantine authorities, highlighting the complex political dynamics of the campaign. Following Nicaea, the Crusaders marched through Anatolia toward Antioch, facing continuous attacks from Turkish forces. One of the most notorious challenges was the journey through the Cilician Gates, a narrow mountain pass where Turkish forces ambushed the Crusaders repeatedly. Many Crusaders were killed, wounded, or captured, and the harsh conditions tested their endurance and faith. Yet their leaders, like Bohemond of Taranto and Godfrey of Bouillon, inspired their troops to persevere, emphasizing the religious significance of their mission. Despite the heavy losses, the Crusaders learned to adapt to the tactics of the Seljuks. They improved communication between different contingents, strengthened their formations, and developed strategies to counter ambushes. These experiences in Anatolia forged the Crusader armies into a more disciplined and battle-hardened force. The early battles in Anatolia revealed the challenges of the First Crusade: long supply lines, internal disagreements, and an enemy skilled in unconventional warfare. Yet each victory and each hardship strengthened the resolve of the Crusaders, bringing them closer to their ultimate goal, the capture of Jerusalem and the Holy Land. One of the most dramatic and pivotal events of the First Crusade was the Siege of Antioch, lasting from October 1097 to June 1098. Antioch, a major city in northern Syria, was strategically important, controlling key trade routes and serving as a gateway to the Levant. The city was heavily fortified, with walls that had withstood numerous attacks over the centuries. The Crusaders knew that capturing Antioch was crucial to their ultimate goal, reaching Jerusalem. The siege began with the Crusader forces surrounding the city, cutting off supplies and attempting to breach its walls. Life outside Antioch was grueling. Soldiers endured harsh winter weather, food shortages, disease, and constant harassment from Turkish reinforcements. The Crusaders' morale was severely tested, and tensions among leaders threatened to break their fragile unity. Bohemond of Taranto emerged as a decisive figure, organizing the troops and negotiating strategies that would eventually turn the tide. Inside the city, the defenders were equally determined. They launched counterattacks, tried to break the siege, and relied on supplies hidden within the city walls. For months, neither side could claim a decisive advantage. Desperation and famine began to take a toll on both the besiegers and the besieged. Yet the Crusaders remained committed, driven by religious conviction and the promise of heavenly rewards. A turning point came when Crusader scouts discovered a hidden tower or section of the city walls, historical accounts vary, allowing Bohemond and his forces to infiltrate Antioch. Once inside, they opened the gates for the rest of the army. The Crusaders captured the city in June 1098, a moment celebrated as a triumph of faith and strategy. However, the victory came at a cost. Thousands had died from hunger, disease, and battle. Remarkably, the Crusaders faced another challenge immediately after the capture. A large Muslim army led by Kerboga of Mosul laid siege to the newly captured city. Outnumbered and weakened, the Crusaders relied on morale, religious motivation, and tactical ingenuity. A key factor in their survival was the discovery of the Holy Lance, believed to be the spear that pierced Christ's side, a relic that inspired the soldiers and strengthened their belief that God was on their side. The successful defense of Antioch marked a turning point in the First Crusade. It demonstrated the Crusaders' resilience, the importance of leadership, and the role of faith in medieval warfare. Antioch became a launching point for the final march toward Jerusalem, setting the stage for one of the most famous sieges in history.
After the grueling Siege of Antioch, the Crusaders faced one of the final and most important phases of their campaign, the March to Jerusalem. By late 1098, the Crusader armies were weakened by months of battle, disease, and hunger, yet their determination remained strong. Jerusalem, the holy city revered by Christians, Muslims, and Jews, was still over 600 kilometers away, across difficult terrain and hostile territory. The journey was not only physically demanding, but also strategically complex. The Crusaders had to navigate deserts, mountains, and valleys while avoiding or confronting Muslim forces loyal to the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the Seljuk Turks in Syria. Leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto carefully coordinated the movement of troops, supplies, and siege equipment, ensuring the army could maintain cohesion despite exhaustion and internal rivalries. During this march, the Crusaders faced constant threats of ambushes and raids. Local Muslim garrisons and nomadic forces harassed them at every step, forcing the Crusaders to adapt their tactics. They learned to protect supply lines, create defensive formations, and use scouts effectively. Despite the danger, the idea of reclaiming Jerusalem fueled their perseverance, as religious fervor and the promise of indulgences kept morale high. As they approached the outskirts of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders began planning the final assault. Intelligence about the city's defenses was limited, and the Crusaders knew the Fatimids had fortified Jerusalem to repel any attack. Engineers and soldiers began constructing siege towers, ladders, and other equipment necessary for breaching the city walls. Meanwhile, prayers, religious ceremonies, and processions reinforced the spiritual motivation of the army, reminding them that they were fighting for a sacred cause. The march to Jerusalem was not only a military endeavor, but also a psychological and spiritual journey. Soldiers reflected on their suffering, sacrifices, and the divine purpose of their mission. Their unity,
forged through hardship and shared faith, became crucial for the upcoming siege. By the time the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, they were battle-hardened, experienced in siege warfare, and deeply motivated by the vision of capturing the Holy City. This march set the stage for the climactic Siege of Jerusalem, a battle that would define the First Crusade and leave a lasting mark on both European and Middle Eastern history.
In June 1099, the Crusaders finally arrived at the walls of Jerusalem, the ultimate goal of their campaign. The city, sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims, was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate. Jerusalem was heavily fortified, with thick stone walls, towers, and well-prepared defenders. For the Crusaders, capturing the city was both a spiritual mission and a military challenge that would test all their skills and endurance. The siege began with the Crusaders surrounding the city to cut off supplies and reinforcements. They constructed siege towers, ladders, and other equipment to breach the formidable walls. Despite being exhausted from the long march and previous battles, the Crusaders were motivated by religious fervor, believing that God was guiding them. Daily prayers, processions, and the display of the cross kept morale high among the soldiers, even in the face of starvation and heat. The defenders, led by Fatimid commanders, put up fierce resistance. They launched counterattacks, poured boiling liquids on attackers, and reinforced weak points in the walls. The battle was brutal, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Crusaders had to adapt their strategies constantly, coordinating assaults from different directions and using siege engines effectively. After weeks of intense fighting, a turning point came when the Crusaders managed to scale the walls using ladders and siege towers. Once inside, they opened the gates, allowing the main army to enter. The capture of Jerusalem on July 15, 1099, was marked by widespread violence as the Crusaders killed many of the city's defenders and inhabitants. While these events were tragic, they were also viewed by the Crusaders as divine justice and the fulfillment of their sacred mission. The fall of Jerusalem had enormous religious and political significance. For the first time, Western European Christians controlled the city, establishing several Crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of king, instead taking the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, highlighting the spiritual nature of the conquest. The Siege of Jerusalem demonstrated the Crusaders' combination of faith, strategy, and perseverance. It also set the stage for further crusades, as both European and Middle Eastern powers reacted to this dramatic shift in control over the Holy Land. After the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders faced the critical task of consolidating their gains. Controlling the city alone was not enough. They needed to secure surrounding territories, establish governance, and defend against potential counterattacks. This led to the creation of the first Crusader states, which would form the foundation of European presence in the Levant for decades. The most significant of these states was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, established under Godfrey of Bouillon, who took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, emphasizing his spiritual leadership over political authority. Other Crusader states included the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These states were strategically located to control trade routes, fortify key cities, and provide staging points for future campaigns. Governing these territories presented many challenges. The Crusaders had to maintain order among a diverse population, including Christians, Muslims, and Jews, each with their own traditions and loyalties. They relied heavily on fortifications and castles, which served as both military strongholds and administrative centers.
Leaders like Bohemond of Toronto in Antioch and Baldwin of Edessa in Edessa focused on consolidating power, building alliances, and defending against Muslim counterattacks. The establishment of Crusader states also caused tensions with the Byzantine Empire. While the Byzantines had initially requested help against the Seljuk Turks, many felt sidelined or betrayed when the Crusaders claimed key territories for themselves. These tensions would influence the politics of the region for years, complicating relations between Western European powers and Eastern Byzantine rulers. Economically, the Crusader states relied on a combination of local resources and support from Europe. Trade routes were crucial for supplying armies and settlers, and European merchants established connections with cities in the Levant. Religious motivation remained central, with pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, reinforcing the Crusaders' spiritual authority and legitimizing their rule. The creation of Crusader states marked a significant turning point in the First Crusade. It transformed a military expedition into long-term occupation and political control. These states would become focal points for future conflicts, both with Muslim powers seeking to reclaim territory and among the Crusaders themselves, whose rivalries sometimes threatened unity. The foundation of these states set the stage for the complex, often violent interactions between East and West in the centuries to come, and for the subsequent crusades that would follow in the 12th and 13th centuries.
The First Crusade had profound and lasting effects on both Europe and the Middle East, reshaping politics, religion, and society. In Europe, the Crusades strengthened the influence of the Catholic Church, demonstrating its ability to mobilize large armies across national boundaries. The Pope's call to arms showed that religious authority could unite kingdoms and principalities that were otherwise often in conflict. Knights and nobles gained prestige, wealth, and lands, while common people were inspired by tales of heroic deeds and spiritual rewards. Economically, the Crusade also had a major impact. Trade between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean flourished as Crusader states created demand for European goods and facilitated the flow of spices, textiles, and other commodities. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa benefited the most, establishing commercial colonies and naval dominance in the region. This growing trade network laid the groundwork for the European Renaissance centuries later. In the Middle East, the First Crusade disrupted established political and social structures. The capture of Jerusalem and the creation of Crusader states threatened Muslim powers in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. While the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt had initially struggled to defend Jerusalem, the Crusaders' success provoked a long-term response, leading to the rise of leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and eventually Saladin, who would unify Muslim forces in later crusades. Religiously, the crusade intensified Christian-Muslim tensions. The violent conquest of Jerusalem, including massacres of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, left deep scars that were remembered for generations. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land became more complicated, and trust between communities eroded. For Jews in Europe, the Crusade also brought persecution, as some mobs attacked Jewish communities along the route to the Holy Land, falsely justifying violence in the name of faith. Socially, the Crusade fostered a sense of shared European identity among Christians. People from France, Italy, Germany, and other regions fought together, despite cultural and linguistic differences. This collective experience highlighted both the potential for unity and the challenges of coordinating diverse groups under a single religious cause. Overall, the First Crusade reshaped both continents. In Europe, it reinforced the Church's spiritual and political authority and stimulated economic and cultural exchange. In the Middle East, it introduced a new era of conflict and interaction between Christians and Muslims, setting the stage for centuries of military and cultural encounters. The success of the First Crusade was shaped not only by faith and determination, but also by the leadership of several remarkable figures.
These leaders combined military skill, political acumen, and religious conviction to guide their troops across hostile lands and achieve their ultimate goal, capturing Jerusalem. One of the most notable leaders was Godfrey of Bouillon, a French nobleman renowned for his piety and military skill. After the capture of Jerusalem, Godfrey was offered the title of king but refused it, taking instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His leadership was critical during the march to Jerusalem and the final siege, as he inspired loyalty among his troops and maintained discipline among a diverse army. Bohemund of Taranto, a Norman leader from southern Italy, was another key figure. Known for his strategic mind and boldness in battle, Bohemund played a decisive role during the Siege of Antioch. He led daring assaults and negotiated effectively to gain control of Antioch, establishing himself as its ruler. Bohemund's ambition often put him at odds with other Crusader leaders, yet his military contributions were indispensable. Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest and most influential nobles in Europe, also joined the crusade. Known for his devout faith, Raymond was deeply committed to the religious objectives of the campaign. Unlike some leaders motivated by personal gain, Raymond focused on spiritual fulfillment and the protection of holy sites. He played a key role in planning sieges and ensuring that religious observances were maintained during the campaign. Other important leaders included Hugh of Vermandois, Robert of Normandy, and Baldwin of Boulogne, each contributing to different phases of the crusade. Baldwin, for example, established the County of Edessa, the first Crusader state, demonstrating his ability to turn military success into political authority. These leaders often had competing ambitions, which sometimes led to disputes, but their shared goal of reaching Jerusalem kept them united. The leadership of the First Crusade was a balance of strategy, faith, and personal ambition. The success of the campaign depended on these figures making crucial decisions under extreme pressure, whether in battle, negotiating alliances, or managing logistics. Their actions not only shaped the outcome of the First Crusade, but also influenced the political landscape of the Crusader states for decades to come. By understanding these leaders, we see that the First Crusade was not just a religious movement, it was a complex combination of military skill, diplomacy, and personal conviction.
The First Crusade was not only a religious journey, but also a remarkable example of medieval military strategy. The Crusaders faced the challenge of fighting far from home, in unfamiliar terrain, and against enemies skilled in different styles of warfare. Their success relied on careful planning, adaptability, and innovative tactics. One of the most important strategies was siege warfare. Cities like Nicaea, Antioch, and Jerusalem were heavily fortified, and direct assaults were often impossible. Crusaders used siege towers, ladders, battering rams, and catapults to breach walls. Engineering skills were crucial, as teams of soldiers and craftsmen worked together to construct and operate these complex machines. Coordinated attacks, often from multiple points along the city walls, increased the likelihood of success. Battlefield tactics also played a critical role. The Crusaders relied on heavily armored knights as the backbone of their forces, using cavalry charges to break enemy lines. Foot soldiers provided support and protected supply lines. However, the Crusaders had to adapt to the guerrilla-style warfare of the Seljuk Turks, who excelled in ambushes and hit-and-run attacks. Over time, the Crusaders developed formations to protect against cavalry skirmishes and used scouts to gather intelligence about enemy movements. Logistics and supply management were another key element. Moving thousands of men, horses, and equipment across deserts, mountains, and rivers required careful planning.
Crusader leaders organized supply lines, rationed food, and coordinated rest stops to maintain army strength. This logistical efficiency was a major factor in the Crusades' ultimate success, especially during long sieges and marches. Psychological tactics were also used. The Crusaders leveraged religious symbolism, processions, and the display of relics like the Holy Lance to inspire their troops and intimidate opponents. Morale was critical, especially during long sieges where exhaustion and disease threatened to weaken the army. Leaders used speeches, prayers, and ceremonies to reinforce faith and unity among soldiers. Lastly, alliances and diplomacy were part of the Crusader strategy. Negotiations with local rulers, including the Byzantines and some Muslim leaders, helped secure safe passage, reinforcements, or temporary truces. These alliances allowed the Crusaders to focus their strength where it was most needed. In summary, the First Crusade combined medieval military techniques with religious motivation. The ability to adapt to new challenges, use technology effectively, and maintain high morale made the Crusaders successful against numerically or strategically superior foes.
The First Crusade was a monumental undertaking, but it was also a journey filled with extreme challenges and hardships. Crusaders faced not only the dangers of battle, but also the harsh realities of medieval travel, disease, starvation, and internal conflict. Understanding these difficulties highlights the courage and resilience required to complete the campaign. Disease and starvation were constant threats. Armies traveling across Europe and the Middle East often faced long stretches without reliable food or clean water. During sieges, particularly at Antioch in Jerusalem, supplies were limited, leading to hunger and malnutrition. Outbreaks of disease, such as dysentery and typhus, claimed thousands of lives. Even the strongest soldiers were weakened by illness, which made battles even more perilous. Harsh terrain and weather added to the Crusaders' struggles. They crossed deserts, rivers, and mountain passes, sometimes during scorching summers or freezing winters. The march through Anatolia, for example, was particularly brutal, with narrow passes exposing the army to ambushes and constant harassment from Turkish forces. Maintaining formation, protecting supplies, and ensuring communication across a diverse army were daily challenges. Internal disputes and leadership rivalries also threatened the success of the crusade. Leaders like Bohemond, Raymond, Godfrey, and Baldwin often had conflicting ambitions. Disagreements over strategy, spoils, and territorial control sometimes caused tension within the army. Despite these conflicts, the Crusaders managed to unite under the common religious goal of reaching Jerusalem, demonstrating remarkable discipline and determination. Psychological stress was another challenge. Crusaders endured months of uncertainty, witnessing death, suffering, and the destruction of cities. Pilgrims and soldiers alike had to reconcile the brutality of war with their spiritual beliefs. Religious rituals, prayers, and the veneration of relics helped sustain morale, but fear and fatigue were constant companions. Loss of life was staggering. Many crusaders died before reaching their objectives, whether due to combat, disease, or exhaustion. Yet those who persevered were motivated by faith, the hope of spiritual reward, and the promise of land or titles in the newly conquered territories. The hardships faced by the Crusaders underscored the extreme difficulty of the First Crusade. It was not simply a military expedition, it was a test of human endurance, faith, and resilience. The ability of these armies to overcome such immense challenges was a key factor in the eventual success of capturing Jerusalem and establishing the Crusader states.
The First Crusade left a profound legacy that shaped both Europe and the Middle East for centuries. Its immediate success, capturing Jerusalem and establishing Crusader states, had far-reaching political, religious, and cultural consequences. It marked the beginning of a new era of interaction, conflict, and exchange between East and West. In Europe, the Crusades strengthened the power and influence of the Catholic Church. Popes demonstrated their ability to mobilize entire populations, uniting diverse kingdoms under a religious cause. The campaign also gave European knights and nobles opportunities for wealth, land, and prestige, reinforcing the feudal system while simultaneously exposing them to new cultures and ideas. Trade between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean flourished, benefiting Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, which became major economic powers. The Crusade also had a lasting impact on Christian-Muslim relations. The capture of Jerusalem and subsequent massacres fueled deep mistrust and hostility, setting the stage for centuries of conflict. Muslim powers gradually adapted to the Crusader presence, eventually uniting under leaders like Nur ad-Din and Saladin to reclaim lost territories. The Crusades became a defining element in Middle Eastern history, influencing politics, military strategy, and religious identity. The Crusader states themselves, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli, were fragile but strategically important. They became centers of European influence in the region, facilitating cultural and technological exchanges. Castles, fortifications, and military innovations introduced by the Crusaders impacted both European and Middle Eastern warfare. Culturally and socially, the First Crusade inspired stories, chronicles, and legends that shaped European identity. The notion of pilgrimage, religious duty, and martial honor became central themes in literature and art. However, it also highlighted the darker aspects of religious zeal, including intolerance, violence, and persecution. The First Crusade demonstrated the power of faith, determination, and leadership, but it also revealed the complexities and consequences of cross-cultural conflict. It was a journey that combined human ambition, religious devotion, and political strategy, leaving a legacy that influenced both continents long after the armies returned home. In conclusion, the First Crusade was more than a military expedition. It was a transformative event that changed the course of history. Its story of courage, struggle, and faith continues to fascinate historians and audiences alike, reminding us of the enduring impact of human ambition and belief.